Do you have a favorite crawdad place? Crawdad boil?
Yeah, there's just a neighborhood boil place just down the two of them just down the road that we get crabs and crawfish from. Crawfish kind of start, late winter, early spring, and they're pretty small
So,
right now. The
do you
problem,
have a
of
favorite
course, last year was
crawdad
that we
place?
were on
Crawdad
lockdown, and
boil?
so there weren't any restaurants to sell to, and I mean it was like $2 a pound. It was crazy, and
Oh wow.
they just couldn't sell many of them. And then we had the hurricanes, and it really disrupted a lot of the farming and agriculture because they usually use the rice paddies in the winter, and then in spring they harvest and then plant rice in those same fields and get essentially two crops off the same ground.
It's so interesting how they get those and all that. If I'm driving through, grew up in Florida. It was just the goal was to always find some, off the beaten path restaurant, not New Orleans or anything, but
No,
like you're in just some
in the country,
yeah.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
just
But you get that unique dialogue in the western part, the Cajun uh, Creole dialogue, language, whatever variant, and it's just so interesting. And I always try and stop at there's two or three really famous meat places for sausages and boudin, smoked andouille, and my wife then processes it into her magical stews, and
nice.
I'm a pretty lucky guy. And she likes it hot and spicy like I do.
So the thing with the craw, I haven't had one in a while, boil is, you go to these places and you get all you can eat. And the goal is to avoid, but you have to be strategic. You have to avoid the cornbread and even the corn, even though it's in there, and because you're going to just fill up real estate, and you just want all of it for the crawfish.
And the little tails that come out of it.
Right. I'll eat 75 of them, but then it's like if you eat a piece of cornbread, which I love, it's precious real estate in your stomach. Which
you can take it to go and have it for later. Warm it up in the microwave or put it on the dashboard while you're driving and warm it up that way. I've done that.
I just get anxious when I go to those places because I'm like,
okay.
Well,
I love local foods like that. Wherever I travel, I try and ask the locals where the best spot is, and what somebody told me one time is it's where all the cars are.
Right. Well, you could go to an Olive Garden or Red Lobster, and there'll be a lot of cars there too. So you got to be.
I know the small little
yeah.
Roadside places where all the vehicles are at the lunch hour, the dinner hour. That's because usually they're working class people going into these places or families at night. It'll be nice to get the vaccine out there and get our country kind of recovering. It's a mess.
I think there'll be momentum. There'll be this sort of anxiousness at first, but then they'll be like, well, wait a sec, that community went back to normal. What? And I just had a nice conversation with an old friend of mine in Australia. I lived there for a few years, about 15 years ago, but we've stayed in touch. And she's just there in Queensland, Australia. And I'm like, what's going on? And, I sort of know, but no community transmission. Everything's normal. No mask wearing, concerts, sporting events. They took it seriously. And so they can't travel anywhere. The government's saying you're not going anywhere. But
they won't let anyone in either. They
right.
won't let Americans in, especially because we're a shithole country.
Well, no. She was telling me there's 30,000 Australians living in the U.S. and they won't let them come back yet. It's just like, that's so humiliating. But it's a reminder. It didn't have to be like this. They were relentless for a few months there, and they're benefiting from it. So it is what it is.
Well, and the leadership has to come from numero uno. If your chief elected leader doesn't lead and provides disinformation and disrespect for the scientists and health people, I mean, we're in the toilet, man. It's going to take 20 years to recover from 4 years of this.
I know. Well, Calvary is.
I'm willing to get on it. I'm willing to get on it and fix it.
Well, we're not going to get political in this discussion. But listen, we're getting at the top of the hour. I think we can go ahead and get started. So, like I said, I'm going to start the actual episode, and I will just see you on the other side.
Thanks, buddy.
Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode.
Hey Adapters, welcome back. Today our guest is Roderick Scott. Roderick is a board chair at the Flood Mitigation Industry Association with over 30 years of contracting experience in flood damage repairs, historic building renovation, and flood hazard mitigation projects, with around 1,500 elevations completed. His passion is flood hazard mitigation and the saving and reutilization of irreplaceable historic resources. Hey Roderick, welcome to the show.
Hey, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing well. So, welcome to the show. We've chatted before. We were at the Keeping History Above Water conference. It's, I think it's probably been a couple of years, or was that just last year? Everything seemed to,
It was the year before, but yeah, that was the last time we saw each other, and very interesting. Followed that conference since the beginning, and actually I've been accepted to the Charleston conference, which was supposed to be in the spring, as a presenter, but I think it'll be in the fall, hopefully.
Well, okay, let's just jump in with the association you're working with, the Flood Mitigation Industry Association. What is it, and why is there a need for this association?
Okay, so we know that the climate is changing. A lot of debate on why that is, but it is changing. It's documented. Flood risk is increasing because the increasing warmth of the climate is creating more intense and more frequent storms with worse flooding, and sea level rise is another deal that we have to deal with, and an issue that we have to deal with. And I live in coastal Louisiana, so we're very aware of sea level rise and the increased number of storms. We had 5 hit the state this year in 2020. So with that increased risk comes this tremendous increase in flood insurance that we're seeing with the National Flood Insurance Program. And the private insurance companies are very reluctant to cover these older high flood risk buildings in the private insurance sector. So what's happening is there's an increase in demand to retrofit or adapt the buildings. Residential buildings can only be elevated. They can't be dry flood proofed for insurance reasons and safety reasons. And then you have dry flood proofing for non-residential buildings and wet flood proofing for like port buildings that have to be next to the water and are going to get flooded, but you can reduce the damages tremendously by elevating electrical and getting all the welders up off the floor if it's a port that's manufacturing things for the oil industry, for instance, or fishing industries. So we estimate that in this country, our industry estimates, rough guesses, because nobody's counted all these buildings, that there's 3 to 4 million high flood risk, older pre-flood map buildings in the flood zones with this rapidly rising insurance rates and rising flood risk. And so in order to keep those buildings around and have them not flooded again and again, we have to retrofit them. And so with that need comes a lot of innovation. And so 5-6 years ago, there were 2 manufacturers of barriers in front of doorways and flood vents, and now there's 20. And we think it's $1 trillion industry in the next 40, 50 years. And so to retrofit not only these initial older buildings before the flood maps, but also the early flood map buildings, the 70s and 80s buildings, those buildings aren't high enough to withstand what's coming in the future generations. So there's a tremendous need for the retrofit, and there's all these companies that are bubbling up with these products and innovations. And in order to have a voice as an industry, you really need to formulate a nonprofit organization to provide education and advocacy and kind of control the voice of the industry so that we can get good, smart policies in place. Because up to this point, it's primarily been nonprofit voices and government voices and floodplain manager voices, and not the industry that actually has to do the work on the buildings. And so we felt it was very important. So we're young and we're growing, and we're very excited about having this ability in this nonprofit space to do some extra good as an industry.
Okay, so just for you sort of, I think, mentioned some of these, but the actual techniques of when you're doing flood mitigation, if people are watching and want to kind of visualize elevating a home in sort of a generic way, but what are some of the actual techniques that you as you go through this process?
Well, if it's not a residential building, any sort of non-residential building, a meeting space, a church, a school, a factory, a big box store, you have to do what's called a flood risk or flood mitigation assessment. You have to determine how much flood protection you have to have. If you want it certified for flood insurance to get low rates, you have to go through a design process with an engineer and architect, design the system. It has to be able to be installed once a year to be checked. So you put up barriers on the front of the building at the doorways. If you have to, you might have to put up some barriers on windows, depending on how high they are. And so you go through this assessment process, which gets you a preferred project, a best project for the bang for the buck. And then you put a monetary figure to that and what you need to do to get the building flood proofed. And then you get it designed and you get it financed, and then you hire our industry to come in and provide the products and the services to install it. So America is doing a lot of elevations here in Louisiana since Katrina. We've done 36,000, and my town is 80+% elevated now after 15 years since Katrina. We had 3 flood surges this year with all these storms that came around us. But we only have 10 buildings that flood now instead of 400. So it's where communities are going to have to go. And it's nobody asked to do this investment in this generation, but we're going to have to do it. And now we've got an industry that is professional and cares. And when we do our work, we create jobs for all the construction trades.
Okay, so I just want to go to your community. 80%, that's a pretty high percentage of everyone doing that. How does that reflect in regards to, like, if you need to get insurance and stuff? Because who is actually prompting that? What is it? Local strong leadership? Was it because, well, you're not going to get insurance if you don't do this? How did you get that such a high number?
Yeah, and I work all over the country, and to my experience, and being in the industry, it's the most advanced mitigated community in the country and perhaps the world right now. It takes us 3 days to recover from a disaster, a flood, instead of 3 years or 10 years. And so basically, there's a couple of triggers. One is somebody buys a building and they're going to do a lot of improvements. If it's in the flood zone and not compliant, it has to be brought up to FEMA's minimum elevation requirements, plus that magic number of extra feet we call freeboard, which is that safety factor. You only want to elevate once, and the ocean is rising, so just do it to the minimum plus whatever your local ordinance requires. And so there's that, which is what we call the optional or self-financed. There's the pre-disaster grants from FEMA that are available for the repetitive flooded buildings that have, as we call them, the responsible property owners that have flood insurance. Only 30% of the buildings in our communities have flood insurance at the most. And so those people have been flooded several times, and there are grant programs to get their homes elevated. And 80% of our elevations in my community were privately funded as opposed to grant programs. And then I forgot the other factor that makes you go into this process is the substantial damage. So if you're over 50% of the building's value damaged in an event, could be any event, if you're in a flood zone, you have to bring that structure into the elevation minimum requirements.
Okay, so let's go back to the association. It's a relatively new association. Are you finding that are you approaching groups that maybe not, they wouldn't even recognize that they need to be part of this association, or was there sort of already like, okay, this is our area and we just need this representation? Because sometimes you have to convince people like, well, wait a sec, you're right, I'm part of that sector.
I have my own consulting firm, and I spend a lot of time on the emails and phones talking with these folks in the industry. Imagine if we were back in early 1900s when there were 10 automobile manufacturers in this country, and they said, we got to have an association so we can have a voice and in advocacy and policy and work with other groups and things like that, as not as one company, but as a conglomerate of companies, and in the nonprofit space, so that it's away from that individual competition again. So imagine Ford and Chevy sitting down in the same room and they're saying, you got to start this American Automobile Manufacturers Association. And they're like, no, I'm going to bury that guy. There won't be any more Fords out there. It's just going to be Chevy. Well, that didn't happen. And they all joined an association. And that's pretty much what we're encountering, because all of these, relatively young companies under 5-6 years old, are all run by entrepreneurs, inventors, and that mindset is very important for starting and developing products. But it's also suspicious and cautioned, and doesn't see a lot of value in the beginning of working together. But just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, our association has been approached by a European flood conference, and they want a U.S. pavilion. And so we're talking with the Department of Commerce all of a sudden, and about having in the 1800s, we used to ship locomotives by ship over to Great Britain and Europe to sell them at pavilions and industrial conferences. So if you can imagine the same kind of thing. And this is a global issue for low-lying communities near the coast or on rivers.
I imagine as the federal government or even, investors are looking at, dealing with this risk and investing in these communities and such, that they would want an interface like yours to talk about policy and talk about the needs, right? I mean, it's just when you have big grants, they just don't want to talk to maybe just someone on the ground. They need someone who represents a lot of people. So I guess in this respect to the demand that's probably coming, having an association that they can actually invite to a meeting is valuable.
As a matter of fact, 2 years ago, before we had the association, just because I've been kind of out in front on this individually, and people have recognized my 30,000-foot view, I was invited to the Treasury building to sit in a closed meeting with the banks and FEMA and FHA and Treasury. And, they all agreed that it's about $1.5 trillion worth of assets, and 600 billion is going to be required to fix these 3 to 4 million buildings, and you're not going to tear them all down and build new. You're going to have to get them fixed, as many as you can. And so that's exactly what then spurred us on to forming this association, because they said, if the money was made available, would you be able to keep up as an industry? And we saw immediately that we're going to have an association, to have a voice, to develop education programs for contractors, to get more contractors up to speed on doing this, and be ready for what's called the State Revolving Loan Program, which is coming probably in the next Congress when they do the NFIP. And we see it as a huge jobs program for post-COVID. You just got 20 million people out of work. We might as well put them in the construction trades and keep money on the table, food on the table and clothes on the kids, and pay for the car and the house by fixing houses so they don't flood.
What about the notion, and I'm sure sea level rise is something you're following closely. What is it going to mean for coastal communities? And some people would argue that maybe people shouldn't live here at all versus, I'm going to elevate my home, or I'm going to make it, they're being responsible, but then there's this notion of like, well, maybe that people shouldn't be living here at all. How is that issue coming up with your association?
Well, there's a movement called Climigration. It's really a young movement. I went to their first conference and presented last year in New York City at Columbia. And basically, I tried to share with them that by 2200, we're going to move 30 million people back from the coast and 10, 15 million buildings, because you can't just leave the buildings or abandon them. And you're talking about a lot of construction debris in the landfills, and we honestly don't have landfill space for all those buildings. So are we just going to leave them there to rot in the ocean? And probably not. And we don't have enough of those trees anymore to build all new buildings. I don't know if everybody's seen the price of lumber, but we've lost a lot of lumber in the West in fires, and we lost a lot in the East and Southeast with hurricanes. And price of lumber is 30% higher than it was a year or two ago. And it's probably not going down, because it takes 30 years to grow a tree. And so, we always say that, 1,000 square foot of wood frame house is over 200 trees. And so let's reutilize these structures. I have another saying that when the toilet quits working, you'll have to go. And that's when people will start moving back. The low to moderate income, especially the lowest income families, and especially the retired folks in Florida and mobile homes near the water, are going to be the first to relocate away from the water because of these hazards. But, we're made of 75% water. We live in the womb with no air 9 months, and then we come out, and the first thing we want to do is move next to water. And water, we've been moving to the coast en masse since World War II, and half of our American population lives at the coast now. So this is a big project to relocate. I won't use the word retreat that they use, but strategically planned relocation with the structures is coming. And, I'm almost in retirement at this point. Got a few years left in me, and hopefully guide this thing well to be responsive and help a lot of people. But my children and their children are going to be facing a climate that's radically different from the one I grew up in. And we have to be prepared. And that means hardening our buildings and starting to plan to not stay at the coast, because the ocean is coming and we can't stop the ocean.
I imagine, especially a place like Florida that is so flat, that we're going to have a lot of fish habitat. They're not going to break down a lot of these structures, and they're going to leave them there, and it's going to just be future fish habitat. But that's sort of a cynical take on it.
These old oil rigs that are sitting out in the Gulf are beautiful fishing grounds.
Right.
So, yeah, I can see that. Yeah,
big building or something like other houses, they would probably demolish and kind of break down in a year or two, if not sooner. But Well, listen, I started this off talking about the Keeping History Above Water conference, and if people are not familiar with that, and I'm not as familiar as I should be, but, historic preservation is a big area, and I know it's an area that, you're interested in. And so if all things being equal, if people are allocating resources to actually move buildings or retrofit buildings, they're going to look at the historic structures, because there's more value and there's a cultural value. And what's going on in that respect? Are we prioritizing doing these things?
Finally, there's good news. Finally, for 6 or 8 years, I've sat on the National Park Service. National Park Service, Department of Interior, is the mothership of historic preservation on the federal side, and really sets the guidelines and policies for the rest of the country then to adopt at the state and local level. There's been tremendous resistance to elevating buildings in the preservation field. And I've got a couple of scars here, I'm sure, from that effort, because I just won't quit. And I'm not nasty about it, but I just am always there talking about it. And so finally, last fall, the National Park Service produced their flood adaptation guidelines for historic buildings, which is it's a groundbreaking document. And I appreciate the work of the staff so much on this, and I helped contribute some photography, and they toured our town in Mandeville before they finished the documents, and are using pictures from our community because we're really a laboratory. When we first started this, there wasn't any idea of design, and we've got some ugly, tall, stilty buildings. But now they're all beautiful because they're all approved by design guidelines and architect review board, and you can see the whole evolution of design in our community as a laboratory of this experience. And so it really is a future field for young preservationists coming out of college and those preservation programs. The secret is for us to integrate some curriculum into these programs. And there's a lot of resistance currently in these colleges to integrate this floodplain management concepts. But my wife and I just sat on a advisory for a young master's student at Tulane in preservation this year, and he's coming out with a just an awesome document about this whole issue. And so just like anything, our young people, smart young people, are going to see the opportunities, because in reality, we settled at the water's edge and moved back, whether it be the coast or the rivers. So a lot of our historic resources are there, and none of them were built to the right elevation, and they've all got to be retrofitted, most of them. And so there's just a tremendous opportunity to do it right and make it look good for succeeding generations until you have to relocate the structure to higher ground because of the sea level rise.
Yeah, I actually worked at the National Park Service for a while in their climate change program, and I was there when they were working on the cultural resource adaptation manual, and I think it's a little bit different from the technical specs that you're talking about, but I do recall the conversations that we had about helping cultural resources adapt, but at the same time having hard discussions about letting some go. And the Park Service needs to, even though they're legally required to maintain these resources, it's like at the same time, like Fort Jefferson off the Florida Keys, it's like, you're going to have to learn to let things go. And I'm sure, you are having those discussions too. So.
Well, and the difference between the Park Service and the national parks and monuments and wildernesses, all those federally designated areas, it's really owned by us, the taxpayers. So we all have to be in the discussion. It can't just be the Park Service making decisions. Local communities have to be brought in, because very often those sites are an integral part of the local economies. And so, in 1992, we relocated the Cape Hatteras, or 98, we located the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. So it wouldn't fall into the ocean. So those decisions have to be made. They have to be budgeted. But we're talking about millions of privately owned buildings and local government owned buildings, which have nothing to do with federal ownership. And there's way more of them. And our privately owned buildings that are for-profit investment buildings, not churches, nonprofits and things, they produce revenues which keep the whole machine running. If we don't have values in our properties, then we don't have funding for schools or security or sewer and water and things like that. And so what's happening right now is that on millions of these buildings, the flood insurance is going through the roof in the next 10 years. And it's going to be unaffordable. And what's going to happen is that's going to impact the values negatively of these buildings. And remember, we buy buildings to invest in them. We may love them because they're historic and all that, but nobody buys a building to lose money. And what we're seeing now is the values are starting to slip. They're getting harder to sell. In my town, with 80% of them up, that house that's on the ground, you're not going to get what you want out of it anymore. In my town, the prices have suffered dramatically on the sales of these older buildings. And the ones that are elevated are getting above their asking price. So they still want to live in them next to water, but they don't want to flood. And so it's a market driven type thing. And we see it happening at different paces. The Florida market is still red hot. We got this change of tax policy by this administration that's on its way out, and Congress took away the deduction for the interest for the mortgages on high value homes. And so they're selling their properties up north and moving down to Florida in mass. And they're getting above listing price in all of Florida right now. And they're buying these houses that are going to have $9,000, $10,000 flood insurance. Maybe not them, maybe they're buying them with cash, but then they have to sell them at some point. And so again, it's that investment. We're going to have to decide to invest in these buildings this time, or they're not going to be around in 20 years.
Florida has a nice reputation of just destroying other historic buildings anyway. So it won't be, I grew up with them destroying Ringling Hotel in Sarasota and all that. Well, listen, we're at the end of the episode, and I just wanted to kind of end. I want to end with what's next for you. What's going to happen with the association, or I guess some maybe meetings that you're coming up with. What's going on now?
Well, we're going to be in Florida at we've got a pavilion, our first pavilion at the Flood Expo in Florida in January, depending on the COVID situation. We are integrally involved now with FEMA and discussions on certain policies, and we're helping them with technical bulletins for the first time ever, providing input from our industry. And we're getting a lot of more media coverage and understanding and opportunities like this. And we want to thank you again for this opportunity to talk to people about creating jobs by helping people not flood. I couldn't have asked for a better way to finish my lifetime career of work, and I get paid to help people not flood. I get calls when people's properties flood and they don't flood from upstate New York and places in Louisiana that I've elevated, and they're like, oh, next time you're around, you got to come down and eat, and we'll sit outside on our elevated house, and it really is rewarding. So thank you again for this opportunity.
All right, so we're gonna wrap up here, and I want to take you into just chatting before I let you go. We're gonna just do end credits here, but thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
So just hold on one second. Hey, Roderick, we just like to officially close out the episode. So, yep, that was it. That flew by like 24, 25 minutes.
It does so quick. And I think I got some good points in. And
oh, yeah, for sure.
Hopefully people will look us up, and maybe there'll be that one call. Somebody wants to work together. As a matter of fact, I had a call today with Norfolk and the RISE people, and our organization is going to support this think tank of MIT graduates that are doing these the parcel level assessments of all the buildings in the flood zone for communities now. And they've got contracts with multiple counties and parishes in the country now. Their software program, we just want to integrate the costing of these projects into their program with this federal HUD money and come out with a product that everybody can use and have value. So it's exciting.
Well, I imagine some of these relief packages, I don't know if it's going to wait until the Biden administration comes in or if they'll pass one in the next few weeks, but, all sorts of, they're talking money for resilience planning. Does that mean sort of flood mitigation? Who knows? But I'm sure you've got your finger on the pulse of what's going on there.
Well, we're just hoping to get this revolving loan passed because the banks committed to the federal government $600 billion for this loan program if the country can get it up and started. Because they can't loan us the money directly. They have to through the federal government to the state to the local. Then the local government loans it to the property owner and then attaches that loan to the taxes, not to the mortgage. Because if you're at 80% of your property value, they can't loan you any more money. And so we had to come up with this creative financing program called the State Revolving Loan. And it's just right on the edge. We just got to push it across the finish line, and a new executive leadership and perhaps Democrat control of all the chambers would totally allow that. We think that there's enough senators and representatives on the Republican side that live in high flood risk states that, Florida has 600,000 of these buildings, over 500,000 buildings. And it is their Achilles heel. If they don't get the buildings fixed, it's not good.
I got a question here from Mike in the community room. Flood mitigation is clearly necessary, and funding that adaptation is going to be difficult. And while there are definitely state and federal legislative efforts that need to happen, what about corporations that have contributed to greenhouse gas emissions? Do you think there should be some funding coming from U.S. companies toward helping houses adapt to the effects of climate change that they contributed toward causing? If so, how could we get some support from them? All right.
Well, there is this carbon market that's coming. Virginia's now joined the sale of carbon by corporations, and you've got the big lawsuits with Louisiana with the oil companies destroying the coastline here over 50 years. And I think all that's coming. I do. I think it's some alternative financing, but it's not enough. We need $500 billion in 10 years to get all these buildings retrofitted, or they're empty and nobody can buy or sell them, or you're stuck with it if you're unwilling to sell for less than what you've got in it. So we're a train that's going 100 miles an hour through a tunnel, and that light at the end is supposed to be a bridge. And unless we build that bridge, you're just going to zoom right out of that tunnel and into the chasm. And then they're going to change the flood insurance. It's no longer going to be just the flood maps. It's going to be called 2.0, NFIP 2.0, which is going to risk rate all buildings. So there's 3 or 4 million of these oldest buildings pre-flood map, but then there's 30 million buildings that were built to older flood maps, which are not good for the future. They're not going to make it, and so their risk, they're going to go from 500 a year to 2,500 a year pretty quickly once 2.0 comes in, and that's 30 million buildings. So it's not going to get easier. This is only going to get tougher, and the tough have to do their thing in order to provide a safe place for the children of the next round. So I got 4 girls and 7 babies, and I got to get it stronger, way stronger than it is.
So Roderick, I'm going to let you go, and I want to thank you for coming on. This episode hopefully will be available for you, and again, it'll be within Simpatico, but you can download it or put it up to a YouTube channel or whatever you see fit, and just share within your networks. And hopefully it's
as we grow, I think we had talked about creating a Simpatico FMIA channel or
all right,
that, to where we can bring in this industry and they can talk about their widgets, their flood vents or their barriers or whatever it is that they do. And we could have a whole, series of these that could highlight the wonderful innovations that are going on in thought processes and little companies that are starting up to meet this need. And so that's a goal of ours in the next couple of years, is to bring the revenues up enough to share, because it's nonprofit. We just buy some space on Simpatico. So I wanted to try the format, and we'll see how it looks coming out. And if we can pop some B-roll stuff on top of it and whatever, and make it really a zing banger, then we're looking forward to, hopefully this is just the beginning.
Well, the B-roll stuff is already there. When you're watching in Simpatico, it's going to be nice when you see the kind of final product. But that's what people were viewing in Simpatico, is everything integrated. So we just keep the guests kind of in the dark.
And maybe we can offer our member companies a half hour. That's something that we talked about in the very beginning with some of the staff there, is that this is just the intro, and then I can peddle this to them, and we can get more money for memberships and some grants, and we can promote their companies.
All right, let's stay in touch for sure.
All right, thank you, sir. We'll see you.
You can just sign us StreamYard. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, folks, I think we're about to lose Roderick. Yep, looks like he's on the beginning of some big new commitment to retrofit houses. It's going to be expensive. I'm going to sign off here, but I just want to say I am going to be having Dr. Renee Lertzman on, Applying Psychology for a Sustainable World. Full day again. We've got Kayla Hathaway, Ocean Circulation, Climate, and North Atlantic Nutrients on her Climate EDU channel. And then Lee Constable from Australia is researching school strike for climate and Australian youth attitudes. Boy, big day today. All right, I'm going to sign out, but I will be back on in about an hour and 15 minutes with Dr. Renee Lertzman, climate grief, climate trauma, a very big emerging area of climate change. Talk to you soon.